All right. Peace. Shalom. Back again with chapter 17 of The Road from Orion. For me, to expire in humanity's bosom was to be born and become infinite. But if anyone put forward in my presence the hypothesis that a cataclysm might someday destroy the planet, even in 50,000 years, I would be panic stricken. Though I am now delusionized, I cannot think about the cooling of the sun without fear. I don't mind if my fellow men forget about me the day after I'm buried. As long as they're alive, I'll haunt them, unnamed, imperceptible, present in every one of them, just as the billions of dead who are unknown to me and whom I preserve from annihilation are present in me. But if mankind disappeared, it will kill its dead for good. The words John Paul Sartre. Opening my eyes, I saw John before me and heard Lucia directing us outside to the sunny deck where we could talk. I stood up clumsily and followed John into the light. Placing two texts and her notebook on the deck table, Lucia angled the umbrella to block the blinding sun, and without hesitation, I quickly slid into the chair and afforded the most shade. The sun dragon whirled along, breathing fire unto the mountain peaks that glittered like faience. Lucia listened intently to John telling the details of our experiences in Bosch's painting and Cervantes' masterpiece. Again, to my surprise, I learned that John was with me the entire trip and had easily transformed from a tree into a grapevine, into the crystal goblet, into Quixote's sword, and finally into the dung ball I was pushing. You might call this experience quantum evolution. Lucy and John thought that this metamorphosis represented facets of human morality, and that his earlier conversion into one of Geraldine's gems was similar, linked to his becoming the crystal goblet in the last escapade. Death was somehow connected to crystalline structures, as was life after death. At that point, Lucia told us that the geometric ratio pi, which is the mathematical foundation of the whole universe right down to the smallest atom, is evident in the Great Pyramid. The perimeter of its base equals, in length, the circumference of a circle using the height as a radius. The relationship of the height to base length is 3.142857, a number very close to the Greek pi. Glancing at her notebook, where notations were scribbled around a strange diagram, she said, if the pyramid were a clear crystal or glass prism, it would reflect sunlight at angles of 25 degrees. It was coming again. The trivia marching through my mind like an army of atoms, photons, light particles. The sun spins around once every 26 days. The element iron has 26 protons. Bosonic string theory has 26 space-time dimensions. So what, Lucia? Under attack, I was getting impatient thinking that Quixote made more sense than she did. But Lucia was consistent. She threw a right-handed fastball at my head as if she were Denton True, Cy Young, when he pitched 24 and one-third innings without surrendering a hit. The structure of a pyramid resembles the structure of phage lambda, she said, placing a diagram before us. The icosahedral head has 20 equilateral triangles arranged around the face of a spear. Subunits are located around the vertices of the icosahedron. A few viruses with only 60 subunits have been discovered, but most fit 60 times N subunits into their heads. N is called the triangulation number, having values of 1, 3, 4, 7, 9, 12, and up. John shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I knew he remembered the discussion Quixote and I had about Osiris the virus, for he was there within the knight's sword. Lucia hesitated briefly, then continued, telling us that in 1935, when researchers found that viruses could be crystallized like inorganic salts and protein molecules, they argued whether or not viruses were living or non-living. To them, viruses were like salt crystals that replicated their DNA in a host organism. She said that the Latin word virus means slime, poison, pungency, saltiness, and that researchers knew viruses could be supramolecular complexes or a very simple biological unit. Lucia explained that viruses can consist of circles, ovals, long, thick, or thin rods, flexible or stiff rods, or have distinctive heads and tail parts. Whether it was living or non-living really did not matter because it could replicate by finding a host organism. For example, when a virus like Lambda replicates, the DNA moves out of the icosahedral head, going down the tail, which attaches to the organism at a special receptor for binding the sugar maltose. Here, like a syringe, it injects its DNA into the host cell. Lambda only attacks organisms with this special LAM receptor. Once inside the cell, Lambda takes over the host replication machinery, producing phage progeny that spread like a wildfire. She then told us that the Egyptian ruins of the edifice of Taharqa by the sacred lake of Karnak provided additional evidence for her Lambda theory. The sunken remains of the edifice was a monument to the Ethiopian pharaoh Taharqa, who lived 690 to 664 BCE. The excavation of the monument began in 1907 through 08 CE, when G. Lagrange, under the direction of G. Maspero, cleared the edifice by 1969. J. Laufrey had cleared the studied the so-called nilometer. Finally, Leclerc, Richard A. Parker, and Jean-Claude Goyon collaborated in 1979 to describe the text, scenes, and architecture in the large book Lucia had before her. It soon happened that Jean-Claude Goyon not only translated the text, but also provided an interpretation of the Egyptian ceremony that was performed in the ruined building. He wrote that the architectural features of the subterranean rooms suggested that the edifice was dedicated to Osiris, god of the underworld. But Osiris is only present in specific rooms, whereas Amun, god of origins, is the reigning cosmic god of Thebes, who is associated with the deceased king. Lucia explained that the so-called Nilometer, which is the architectural emphasizing a skewed direction, that its tail-like body and structural head attached to the two-wall court into the edifice is a representation of the head and tail structure of Lambda attached to a bacterium's double cell membrane, like the 5 pyramids aligned to the stars of Orion. The Nilometer attached to the edifice represents Lambda attached to its host cell. Both John and I were stunned by this revelation. It was difficult to believe that the pharaoh Taharqa built the Nilometer and edifice to mimic a virus attached to a host organism. Still, we had to admit that the Egyptians constructed 5 pyramids that mirrored stars in Orion, so maybe it was possible. Lucia paged through the text to Leclanche's architectural drawings. She retrieved a sketch from her notebook, a drawing of phage lambda attached to a host cell, and placed it next to Leclanche's drawing of the Nilometer and the edifice. We could easily see the remarkable similarities between the so-called Nilometer attached to the edifice compared to Lambda attached to its host cell. Then Lucia opened a genetics book, showing us an enlarged drawing of the Lambda with its icosahedral head and long tail. Next to this, she placed a profile of the causeway to Khafre's pyramid in Giza. The long, narrow causeway connected to the Great Pyramid, just as the tail connected to the pyramidal lambda head. As you can see, she said, Khafre's pyramid looks like lambda head. The 500-meter causeway looks like the lambda tail. She paused briefly and then said, even the pyramid of Unis, where the pyramid texts are carved, has the same structure, 750 meters, causeway extending to the pyramid head. We stared at the drawing for several minutes in silence, the cool mounting breezes comforting us, but she would not stop. Lucia said that there were also many carvings on the edifice's subterranean walls depicting the decreased sun god and other deities wearing long ceremonial tails. This was additional proof of her thesis suggesting lambda tail structure. Along with this evidence, she said that the underground ceremonies in the edifice mirrored the journey of the deceased sun god through the Duat, matching the same description in the book Amduat and the book of Gates. We realized that Lucia's strategy of linking the edifice's ceremonies to the events in 2 earlier funerary books was a fairly sound evidential base for her lambda's theory about the lytic cycle, the rising Osiris, and the ferrying of the human insert through the host organism, the Duat hell. But she now had connected lambda structure with both the edifice's Nilometer and pyramidal architecture. What this meant was that the Egyptians imagined the deceased pharaoh entombed in the pyramid of lambda head, ready for injection into the host cell, that is, the Duat hell. Marveling at the ability of the pharaohs to use their imaginations to invent their future afterlife, I listened closely to Lucia. She then explained that the ceremony in the edifice described the same path of the events through the Duat hell to eternity, but in less detail. than the Book Amduat and the Book of Gates. The afterlife transformation was only available to the kings and nobilities because they knew the secret pathway. The knowledge was kept from the plebs, or the plebes. At this point, John interrupted her. Lucia, I want to make sure I have this straight. What you are saying is the Egyptians modeled their pyramids and the edifices, nilometer, on lambda structure, right? Yes, Lucia, said Lucia. The causeway of the pyramids represents the lambda tail and the pyramid represents the lambda head. In the case of the edifice, the building itself represents the host organism or cell. The nilometer attached to the edifice represents lambda attached to the host cell. The edifice is the duat. The northwest rooms in the edifice map the journey through the duat, which is the pathway of lambda choosing the lytic lifestyle over lysogeny. The deceased enters the picture as the insert in lambda to be cloned in the host cell, which is the duat, she repeated. Making sure that he understood, John persisted. So when the deceased meets up with the sun god, his consciousness, his genetic essence is inserted into the lambda DNA, which then goes into the host cell. The duat, which is the hell, he said, hoping that she would not agree. Yes, she said. It was as if she had struck us with a bat. Yet I'll talk with the quantum world of atoms. Ooh, yeah. Yet I'll talk with Quixote, rather, was making more sense. We understood that the spiritual world was the quantum world of atoms. We understood that the Egyptians masked their scientific knowledge in religious symbols. The solar viral life form that Quixote spoke of was bacteriophage lambda, phage for short. Both the edifice with its nilometer and the pyramids with their causeways were designed like lambda. The phage transfers or ferries genes between organisms. It also ferries the dead person's genes into the host cell. Lambda can live two different lifestyles. When it chooses lysogeny, lambda hides silently in the DNA like a sleeping Osiris. Then it chooses lysis. The Osiris virus literally rises from the dead as explosively as an attack of soldiers clamoring from a Trojan horse. Lambda is like a plague of locusts. When it erupts, a swarm of hornets, an exponential growth of numbers. Angus Day, Phyllis, Patrice. The meeting of the deceased person with the sun god, John repeated, for the trip through the duat was a meeting where a human is inserted, absorbed into a phage lambda, which then attaches to a host cell. Not a human, John, fragmented DNA, human consciousness, human genetic potential, information, whatever elements remain after death, said Lucia forcefully. Like a robot, John continued, ignoring Lucia's comment. The duat is the host cell, which is like a hell. Lambda DNA is injected into the host cell with its human inserts. It takes over the host cell's replication machinery and reproduces human phage clones, viral human beings. He finally stopped to take a breath, and then the words poured out of John's mouth again like a rush of red poppies replicating. The Egyptians were cloning a new species in the afterlife after death. Is this possible? Lucia just nodded her head, completely agreeing, and then calmly she said, the human species was not created complete and